At the National Security College, we try to use the public seminar series to promote discussion about topics of great significance for Australia's national security. Our previous seminars have tackled matters closer to home or within our region. This has included topics such as serious and organised crime, resilience, our security relationship with Japan, and also the role of hard power in our security posture. But we are keen to cover the broadest possible range of topics, because one of the reasons for forming the joint venture between the ANU and the Commonwealth that gave rise to the National Security College was promote an enhanced understanding of and critical thinking about Australia's national security challenges, no matter what their geographic region or their origin. Also, we wanted to bring about collaboration and contact between government and non-government people with interest in national security issues so that they can build networks and build a greater understanding of their shared perspectives. Tonight is an example of our commitment as we pursue that goal. Interestingly, two major publicly released intelligence estimates covering long-term global futures both identified democratisation and instability in the Middle East as distinct possibilities. In 2004, the United States National Intelligence Committee wrote that democratic progress could make ground within the time period under their examination, which was out to about 2020. A short while later, the very comprehensive British Ministry of Defence study called Global Strategic Trends thought it likely that the desire of some in the Middle East to defend traditional values was likely to create social and political instability when combined with a youth bulge and unemployment and economic stagnation in some of the countries. Well, I think it's fair to say the future ain't what it used to be. These assessments of the Middle East demonstrate a reasonable degree of prescience concerning the challenges and the possible implications of these challenges for the Middle East. Although I didn't get the feeling that either study really thought these changes would come about quite this quickly. Perhaps people also didn't think too much of the self-immolation of one Tunisian in late December 2010 either. But once this defiant act was seized upon by others, the wave of actions has spread from state to state across North Africa, the Gulf, and the East Mediterranean littoral. And this chain reaction, if I can call it that, has seen governments changed, seen significant protests, significant violence, and one civil war at this stage. There is significant coverage of how the events in the Middle East have been playing out in the media, including through the burgeoning array of social media platforms. Some of the implications for this region, or for neighbouring region and for the international community, have been well covered in the mainstream media. But less so have been the coverage of the implications for Australia. And that's where tonight's seminar aims to fill, the gap that tonight's seminar aims to fill. Our first speaker tonight will be Professor Amin Saikal, AM, who has been asked to address the geopolitical dimensions and implications of these events for Australia's security. Amin is Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Centre of Arab and Islamic Studies here at the ANU. Amin brings a remarkable record of analysis and scholarship on the Middle East to the discussion tonight, and I'll ask him to commence shortly with his view. Following Amin will be Dr. Rodger Shanahan, who will address regional responses to the Arab Spring. Rodger has extensive experience in the Middle East in military and diplomatic postings, as well as his own deep research into Middle Eastern terrorist organisations. I'm very pleased to say that Rodger is not only a visiting fellow at the Lowy Institute, but also a senior research fellow here at the National Security College. Our last speaker will be Dr. Matt Gray, who will look at some broader economic dimensions of the situation, in particular energy security. Matt is a senior lecturer and program director at the ANU Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies, and he's recently published a book called Conspiracy Theories in the Middle East. Matthew, I'm sure you're going to have to put out a second edition very soon to cover the events that have been unfolding. I'll ask each speaker to provide about 15 minutes of prepared remarks, and I'll keep a close eye on that, gentlemen, so that we can then hand the floor over to you for questions and discussion. I'd also ask you, when I do invite you to speak, to just please state your name, and I will just briefly restate your question for the video recording just to make sure that we pick it up, because as many of you would realise, we're vodcasting this so that a broader audience can benefit from tonight's proceedings. So with all that housekeeping done, Amin, could I please invite you to address the seminar?
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I will spare you of the use of technology. I'm not very fond of it, apart from the microphone. I called my talk today the Arab's Third Awakening. The current popular uprisings in the Arab world bring to a head a number of watershed historical efforts on the part of the Arab peoples for self-determination. They mark the third Arab awakening in the last 14 centuries, reflecting the Arab people's desire once more to chart their national destinies and methods of governance, with an emphasis on pro-democratic reformation of their societies. If successful, they are set to restructure not only Arab politics, but also the regional geopolitical landscape, entailing far-reaching implications for the wider world. The first awakening came with the advent of Islam early in the 7th century, which resulted in the Islamization of much of the Arab culture and society. It provided the socially divided and feuding Arabs with an impetus that proved instrumental in enabling them to spearhead the building of a multicultural, multi-ethnic empire of faith and to build a majestic civilization over the next 5 centuries. Their civilizational achievements, involving the participation of many non-Arab Muslim and Jewish and Christian thinkers and scholars, revolutionized the world of mathematics and made significant contributions to many other fields of human endeavors, ranging from astronomy to architecture to literature to medicine and historiography. The Islamic civilization arguably made a great contribution to the European Renaissance during the 14th and 15th centuries than what the Arabs themselves had drawn from Hellenistic thought and accomplishments. However, the strength of the Arab Islamic Empire rested primarily on 2 pillars: the religious unity and motivation of Arabs under a single ruler with a claim to divine right and the absence of any major force to challenge it from outside. The first most consequential challenges came from the Crusaders between the 10th and 13th centuries. Although the Arabs eventually met this challenge successfully by defeating the Crusaders and retaking Jerusalem, they could not stave off an onslaught by the Mongols who sacked Baghdad in 1258. From then, the Arabs had lost control of their destiny. It was to be decided for them largely at first by the Ottomans and subsequently by European colonial powers, France and Britain in particular, culminating in the US geopolitical dominance in the Middle East after World War II. A sense of humiliation, guilt, and disempowerment settled in the Arab psyche. A number of mostly Arab-driven Islamic challenges failed to empower the Arabs to restore their past power and prestige and lay solid foundations for an ijtihadi or reformist as against jihadi or combative political transformation and socio-economic recasting of their societies. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 added extra salt to the wound. At the same time, these developments played a critical role in spawning the second Arab awakening. It came with an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and anti-Zionist Arab nationalist struggle, led by Colonel Jamal Abdel Nasser, whose military overthrow of the Egyptian pro-British monarchy and its replacement with a radical Arab nationalist Republican regime in 1952 signaled the dawn of a new era for many Arabs. However, the result was mixed. On the one hand, it spurred many Arabs to realize their yearnings for national freedom, dignity, and modernization. On the other hand, it polarized the Arab countries between largely non-oil radical nationalist and oil-rich conservative states, plunging the Arab world into a cold war of its own. It did nothing in the way of empowering the Arab peoples to free themselves from the tradition of political authoritarianism in favor of political pluralism and democratic participation in charting their destiny. While the US remained steadfast in support of conservative forces to strengthen its position as a hegemonic power by proxy in the Middle East, ruled by secret police, corruption, nepotism, patronage, and inequitable and largely command or a mix of this and limited pro-market socio-economic development became the order of the day in almost all of the Arab countries. Nasser's efforts proved futile in forging a united Arab front. Accompanying this was the cementing of the US-Israeli strategic partnership in Israel's simultaneous defeat of the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian armies in the June 1967 Arab-Israeli war. Nasser died in 1970, and so did his policy of radical Arab nationalism and approach to Arab reassertion. His successors, Anwar al-Sadat and Hosni Mubarak, turned to a policy of peace with Israel through friendship with the United States as their modus operandi. The Arab peoples were once again left bewildered with authoritarianism at home and pressure from outside, a predicament which seriously fractured the Arab soul. The evolving situation could only widen the gulf between the rulers and the ruled in the Arab world and make most Arabs cringe at the thought of their lack of powerlessness in determining their destiny. This situation played a critical role in generating conditions that also subsequently gave rise to Muslim extremism, producing such figures as Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network. The third awakening has come with the current popular revolts, which have already resulted in the overthrow of the dictatorial rule of Ben Ali in Tunisia and Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, bloody struggles in Bahrain, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, and in threatening many more authoritarian regimes across the region. This time, the Arab people's struggle is a call for genuine self-determination and pro-democratic change, a first in the last 800 years. Their key demands center upon political pluralism and wider participation, human rights, rule of law, social justice, equitable social and economic development, better economic and employment opportunities, and no corruption and no cronyism, which have plagued the Arab world for too long. Most of them are devoted to the religion of Islam as their faith, but they have not asked for Islam to underpin the operation of their state and society. Their call is for indigenous-based structural changes as an Arab enterprise. As such, they have provided an alternative to extremist and xenophobic ideals and practices promoted by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Of course, there is no absolute certainty that the Arab peoples will succeed. Revolutions have failed, betrayed, and devoured their makers and children in the past. The Iranian Revolution of 1978-79 is a good example in this respect. The situation in the Arab countries where revolutions have caused the fall of dictatorial rulers, that is Tunisia and Egypt, remains very fluid. In the case of Egypt, what has taken place is essentially a military coup d'etat, driven not by the military, but by the people. The military has rarely proved to be an agent of democratic change in history. However, it is also aware that the pro-democracy elements are very vigilant of its actions and are prepared to mobilize public opposition to it should it fail to live up to its promise of delivering a credible democratic transition. Under pressure, the military has so far taken a number of steps to accommodate popular demands, although this has been punctuated by some authoritarian measures such as the arrest and torture of some pro-democracy activists and failed attempts to ban public protests and industrial strikes. Given Egypt's position as the pivotal Arab state, the country's developments have already had a profound impact on galvanizing pro-democracy opposition forces across the Arab world. Most intensely in Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain, where they are locked in an increasingly bloody struggle for the soul of the nation. In the case of Libya, the situation has resulted in an UN-backed military intervention under the principles of responsibility to protect, to safeguard the Libyan people. With regard to Bahrain, it has resulted in a Saudi-led military intervention, posing a serious challenge to the Iranian regime, whose public stand is to champion the cause of Shiite Islam vis-a-vis the Saudis' claim of leadership of Sunni Islam. The Saudi-led action has certainly heightened traditional regional tensions and rivalries between Iran and Saudi Arabia. However, it is unlikely to culminate in a military confrontation between them. This is for a number of reasons, chief among them are three. The first is that the Iranian Islamic regime is in the grip of serious domestic political and economic problems. Its two-tier Islamic system of governance, placing the Iranian polity between the sovereignty of God, personified by the non-elected but all-powerful position of the supreme political religious leader, and the sovereignty of people, represented by an elected president and National Assembly, has increasingly proved unworkable. It has institutionalized a state-society dichotomy. Further, Iran's economy is in a very poor state, undermined by mismanagement, international sanctions, an aging oil industry, and lack of foreign investment in high technology. It remains very much dependent on oil income, with inflation and unemployment hovering around 30%. The second factor is that the regime, that is the Iranian regime, is keen to preserve the regional influence that Iran has gained in the last many years as a result of American policy failures in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Lebanon, as well as on the Israeli-Palestinian front. Tehran has been able to build some powerful subnational allies within these countries, which together with the Iranian-Syrian strategic partnership has enabled it to preside over an emergent but predominantly Shiite strategic entity stretching from Kabul to Beirut. The third is that the Iranian regime has its hands full in relation to the persistent pro-democracy unrest against Bashar al-Assad's repressive government in Syria, the regime's only reliable Arab friend in the region and critical to its organic relationship with Hezbollah and Lebanon. However, this does not suggest that Iran and Saudi Arabia are unlikely to engage in a conflict by proxy. This is very much on the cards in Iraq, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. While the causes of the third wave of Arab awakening are discernible, no one at this stage can be sure of its outcome or future direction. The only thing that can be said with clarity is that the Arab peoples have made a serious pro-democracy start in pursuit of self-determination, but this is the beginning of a long, arduous, and painful journey. None of the Arab states currently has the necessary institutional and traditional foundations, ranging from separation of powers, rule of law, and an independent judiciary to a vibrant civil society to put them on a smooth path to democratic transformation. The success of this Arab awakening will depend on how the transition is managed and how outside powers, especially the United States, will balance their geopolitical interest with the Arab people's democratic aspirations. The United States does not have a history that can give us much confidence in this respect. The Obama administration's veto of a UN Security Council resolution in February condemning Israeli settlement activities in the Palestinian-occupied territories underscores this point. Further, the inability or unwillingness of the United States and its allies to invoke the same principles that they have applied to Libya in relation to protecting, for example, the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza Strip, against Israel's repressive occupation and measures, and to enable them to have their independence and freedom highlights an anomaly in their Middle East policy that cannot and should not be overlooked. The same applies to the US approach to Bahrain, where it has consented to Saudi military intervention at the cost of backing the demand of the majority of the country's population for constitutional reforms. Once the dust of the present uprising settles in the Arab world, the United States and its allies may seriously regret this anomaly in their relations with the Arab-Muslim world. If the pro-democracy forces succeed in their objectives, it will not only unite the Arabs, but also diminish Israel's claim of higher moral ground as the only democracy in the region. It may well also result in the rationalization of many Arab countries' relations with the United States. In the case of Egypt, a recent credible public opinion has already revealed that some 53% of Egyptians want the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of 1979 to be scrapped and Egypt's relations with the United States be downgraded. This, together with the process of normalization of relations which is underway between Egypt and Iran after 30 years of rupture, must be of utmost concern to the United States and Israel. Whatever the ultimate outcome, the Arab political landscape is set to change, as unpredictable as the direction of this change may be. Given the Middle East's oil-based economic and strategic significance that my colleague Matthew Gray will talk about, their consequences for the rest of the region and the world cannot be underestimated. They carry the potential to give the Arab peoples an unprecedented role in managing their destiny and determining their foreign policy priorities and objectives. At the very least, the Arab peoples have turned the wheels against authoritarianism in pursuit of democratic reforms. Those rulers and outside powers who may ignore this would do so at their own peril. The alternative is authoritarianism and jihadism, on which most Arabs have turned their back. Thank you very much.
Amin, thank you very much for that great kick-off. Can I now pass to Rodger?
Thanks, Dave. I think we all agree it's very strange times in the Middle East. In fact, I just got back at the start of last week from a research visit to Lebanon. I've been going there since 1994, and while I was sitting down having a beer outside in Beirut, I thought, times are so strange in the Middle East that Lebanon is actually an island of tranquility and a sea of unrest, which is probably the first time I've ever been able to say that. And that's even without having a government after 4 months. My talk will be about, in two parts. First part about some aspects of Arab governments' lessons and reactions to the Arab Spring, bearing in mind that the Arab Spring still has some way to play out. And the second part about where Australia has fitted in reacting to events of the Arab Spring. So first, I suppose there's four key lessons that Arab governments have learnt and reactions to the Arab Spring. I suppose the first one, and these will all, I stand in the Arab Spring, is probably going to be, unfortunately, less than we all think it's going to be camp. Happy to debate the point, but that's where I'm coming from with these points. I think the first lesson is the power of the social contract in the Arab world, and that's particularly so in the Gulf, where in exchange for freedom of political expression, people are rewarded economically. I think that lesson has been reinforced, and certainly it's a lesson that Gulf governments in particular are at pains to reinforce. Over the first quarter of this year, for instance, Saudi Arabia has given out $120 billion in handouts to its population, either through soft loans for first home buyers, increasing unemployment benefits, adding 60,000 Saudi citizens to the security force role. The UAE recently announced $1.6 billion in infrastructure improvements to the Northern Emirates, which are the poorest part of the United Arab Emirates. And even for those GCC countries who don't have the same amount of wealth as the others, and I'm talking Bahrain and Oman, the GCC recently announced a package of $20 billion for those two countries to be spent over 10 years, largely in housing construction. Even countries like Morocco have announced wage rises, $5 billion to public sector workers to be spread over 3 years. So all of these governments are trying to buy their way out of the Arab Spring, and it will buy them time. Exactly how much time, we don't know, but it will buy them time, and I don't think you'll see the same degree of political unrest in the Gulf for a variety of reasons, that being one of them, as you're going to see in other parts of the Arab world. By contrast, Syria tried to buy its way out to a small degree early on in the Troubles, announcing a 58% increase to public sector pensions. That still only cost $10 million to the Syrian government. If you're in economically straitened circumstances, as Syria is, then your ability to reinforce a social contract is somewhat less than it is in the Gulf states, and I think we see the result of that in the current unrest in Syria. Again, not the only reason, but they're unable to buy their way out of difficulties. I think the second lesson is the continued utility of military force in maintaining regime stability. Currently, only two Arab countries' regimes have fallen, Tunisia and Egypt, and in both those countries, the military either stayed neutral or drew a line in the sand and refused to cross it, and crossing that red line tended to be attacking protesters. Notice I say military forces, not security forces. The there is a difference, and I think those people who saw the footage of Egyptian police in headlong retreat over some of the bridges across the Nile in the face of protesters would show you that not all security forces are the same. Once the military came in, you didn't see any repeat of that. So I think Arab governments will realise that if you want to guarantee stability, the military is the way to do it. Even in those countries where the military has been split, and I'm talking here about Yemen and Libya, where quite carefully the regimes have ensured that the most capable military units have remained loyal to the centre, mainly because family members are in charge of them. They've been able to at least have a stalemate. And in Libya, where your military is not particularly big, nor is it particularly well trained, and you're under attack from NATO from the air, who has air supremacy, the ability to hang on for so long bears testimony to two things. One, the very poor training of the rebels who are against you, but also the fact that the military is staying loyal to you and is allowing you to stay on. They'll do one of two things. I think perhaps in some of the rulers' minds they think they can outlast the opposition, and I think probably in both those cases that's not going to happen, but it'll allow you to negotiate a better exit for yourself and those close to your regime than you may have been able to expect if you had fallen quickly. And I think that's definitely what's happening in Yemen. And lastly, where security forces have stayed loyal to the centre, the regime survives. Bahrain was a case, but that is unique in the sectarian nature of both the security forces and the protesters and the difference between the two. But also in Syria, where the threat to the centre was and is much more serious. But the military has largely stayed loyal to the centre. There have been some small reports of desertions, but they're mainly small groups of conscripts in units that aren't essential to regime survival. So I think Arab rulers will look back at the performances of the militaries and will continue to see them as an essential element of regime survival. The third element is to deny Iran any opportunity to benefit from political liberalisation that is occurring in parts of the Arab world. There's been a softening of the official attitude towards Iran from Egypt following the fall of Hosni Mubarak, who had a very anti-Iranian stance. How this has manifested itself is the Peninsula Shield Force that went into Bahrain. The two most anti-Iran countries in the GCC, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, contributed ground forces, and while most reports say that they've done little or any to support the Bahraini security forces because the Bahraini security forces still had control over the situation, it was designed to send a message to Iran that Bahrain was still very much in the Sunni Arab fold. So it was more a demonstration effect than a practical effect. The other country that sent any kind of force was Kuwait, which has a functioning parliamentary system, and Kuwait being approximately one-third Shia. There was a very heated debate in Parliament, and the Emir, with the wisdom of Solomon, sent a ship to Bahrain. So neither fish nor fowl. He appeased his Gulf Arab neighbours, but he didn't upset his constituents. And unfortunately, that leaves us the last point, where I think what we'll see is not so much reform as dialogue. I'm very pessimistic that outside of those countries whose regimes have fallen, or in the case of Tunisia is likely to fall, and Yemen will likely change, I think we'll see lots of dialogue, and I think we'll see lots of dialogue across the breadth of the Arab world, but I don't think we'll see much substantive political reform because of those, particularly those first two lessons. You can buy your way out, largely, for at least half of the states, and those ones that can't buy their way out, you can maintain your grip on the country. Now, where does Australia fit into that? We are on the, it would be fair to say that the Middle East is not central to our strategic outlook, but we do have particular niche interests. Trade is particularly one. I know under this current government that access to UN Security Council votes would be another motivating factor. But the whole issue of democratisation, which philosophically all Western countries support, sets up that dilemma that faces most countries. Principle versus pragmatism in dealing with this kind of issue. And I think it's fair to say that this government has, on the balance, supported pragmatism over principle. That's not meant as a criticism, because I honestly believe that's the only way that you could do things. Systems of governance in that part of the world are very personality-based. Institutions of governance are weak. Institutional memories of individuals ruling countries are long. They outlast governments, they outlast ministers. So if you're acting in the national interest, you have to take individual considerations of Arab rulers into account, probably to a, well, not probably, but to a much greater extent than you would in Western democratic countries, because the implications for future governments on bilateral relations are more significant, because that same person is dealing with a range of governments. And the UAE provides a good example for that. Late last year, the UAE government kicked out Canadian forces from the Amin airbase with 30 days notice over a simple commercial dispute over landing rights. Canadian government wouldn't give the landing rights to Etihad and Emirates Airlines that the UAE government sought, and they gave the Canadian government 30 days to vacate the base. The same person who made that decision has been in power for several years. He's going to be in power for decades further on. So you need to understand why he is thinking, what way he thinks, and what there is in Australia's national interest in taking a particular policy position. The US government was relatively, but not overly, critical of the Bahraini government's security forces' approach to its largely Shia protesters. And the UAE and Qatar, who are the two countries who had signed up to provide aircraft to the NATO no-fly zone, out of those two countries, the UAE took offence at the United States remarks, and a former UAE Air Force commander went on record saying that the aircraft had been on the tarmac and the engines were switched off. And then following a reclarification of the remarks several days later by the United States, the engines were turned back on. So the UAE was willing to obfuscate and eventually deny its support to the UN no-fly zone over something as relatively small as official criticism of one of its allies' approaches to its own internal political disputes. So these are the kind of issues that Australian government has to tread while maintaining a principled line, but a pragmatic line. And I think it's done that in the case of Bahrain. It's been very hairy-chested on Libya. It's been much more reticent in making any criticism of democratisation movements in countries with whom we have significant trading links. The UAE hosts our military base in the Middle East. We do over $4.5 billion of merchandise trade with the UAE. We do over $2 billion of merchandise trade with Saudi Arabia. They have alternative sources that they could go to if they so desired, but they don't. Individuals make those commercial decisions. They could impact on Australia. We do about $300 million trade with Libya. We do about $300 million trade with Egypt. The impact of getting those decisions wrong are much less likely to impact on Australia's national interest. And I'll just finish off on that issue of hairy-chestedness and our Foreign Minister in particular approach to responsibility, invocation of responsibility to protect in advocating the no-fly zone over Libya, advocating but not putting forces towards it. The issue of responsibility to protect is a very difficult one. In principle, it sounds fine. In practice, it's difficult. Difficult for a variety of reasons. There's a subjectivity issue. Why would we attack? Why would we provide military forces to Libya to protect civilians? We don't do it in Ivory Coast why we don't do it in Syria. It's easy to do it in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, over 40 years, had upset pretty well every Arab leader at least once, often several times. He didn't have too many friends in that part of the world. But still, even though he was not liked, only 2 out of the 21 Arab League states provided forces to that. So even though people could support you diplomatically, they still wouldn't support you physically. What then happens for Australia, who's been very busy advocating a no-fly zone under responsibility to protect in far-flung Libya, when in the future there's an issue of similar magnitude in our region, but for our own particular political reasons, we don't want to contribute to that. How then do future governments address that issue of ourselves being willing to advocate a no-fly zone in a country far away, but yet not advocating it under similar circumstances closer to home? I've been given the wind-up, so I'll leave it there. I know there'll be questions after, but thanks very much.
Roger, thank you very much for that. And for our last speaker, Matthew Gray.
Okay, good evening. Let me begin, I suppose, by stating something which you're either going to fervently agree with me or disagree with me on, I suspect, and that is that, to me, the sources of the protests that we've seen across the Middle East in the last 6 months are overwhelmingly economic in nature. I think, to me, this is a sort of stewing problem that's been there in the region for a long time, that people have become frustrated over what they see as negative impacts of economic liberalisation, or that economic liberalisation has helped a minority in the country and not a majority. People see growth figures of 7-8%, but inflation figures of 10 or 12% in countries like Egypt, and they say, this is not benefiting me, I don't know who it's benefiting. There's a lack of opportunity for young people, and generally that's the most common thing you find if you talk to the youth of the Arab world in Iran, is they say, what we most need, what we most want out of government is opportunity. We want to be well educated, we want good jobs, well-paying jobs, security, we want to be able to afford our basic social goals, a little bit of social mobility, marriage, family, things like that. And one of the saddest and also politically scariest things that you'll hear routinely in some countries, in Egypt and elsewhere, is people say, young males, sometimes as old as 30, say to you, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to afford to get married. Been educated, I've done my military service, and what am I left with? I'm unemployed, I have a 10 to 12 year wait list for a government job, which even then won't be terribly prestigious, won't challenge me greatly, and won't pay me enough for a large family, or even the cost of getting married. So those types of things are what bug people. And we're talking here about a region which has the worst overall unemployment record of any region in the world, about 11.5, 12% average unemployment, depending on whose figures you believe. About 25% average youth unemployment. Again, between 22 and 28%, depending on whose figures you believe. You're talking about almost 1 in 3 young people being out of work. And those are the official figures, which are almost certainly more optimistically stated than they should be. The other great issue is corruption. Almost every country in the region. There's 2 that sort of rank rather well on corruption, Qatar and the UAE. And those are the 2 that have had the least amount of protest or threat of protest, interestingly. Most of the region, though, has real corruption issues, often embedded at multiple layers. In some countries, you can sort of see large public buildings, and the gossip will tell you what it cost in terms of corruption to get approval for that building to be built. People, though, see the corruption day in, day out. You pay people informally to do things if they're unemployed. You pay to get little things done at government ministries or at the post office or things like that. You're continually paying as a local for corruption, and that's an issue which people are really frustrated about. And you may occasionally hear someone defend it. I've had Egyptians, Syrians and others say to me, well, you know, At least I can sort of buy my way around bureaucracy or out of trouble. But if they understand the nature of corruption in the Western world, they look at that and they look at their own situation very unfavourably. What you've also got hitting the region are high prices, high energy prices. We think of the Middle East as an oil, gas, energy exporting region, but they are a large consumer of energy. So high energy prices hit them as well. And if energy is subsidised, as it is in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran and elsewhere, it's hitting the government's back pocket. And high oil prices. Remember the instability of 2007, 2008, when you had a spike in world food and commodity prices? We're back up to those sort of levels, remember. So we're seeing, I think, not coincidentally, the impacts of that feeding into these protests as well. Now, that's not to say that the economics alone explains everything that's going on. It doesn't. People do still have a yearning for political freedom or greater social freedom, young people in particular. And I think also things like sect are important when we're looking at places like Bahrain. Sect, what type of identity people have within the community as long-standing inhabitants of the region, as long-standing Shia, as Iranian Shia migrants or whatever. There are dynamics like that at play here for sure. But I think economics is the overarching source of what's going on. And to the extent that we're seeing the Arab street back, this is not the old Arab street worried about Palestine or responding to a charismatic popular leader. This is the Arab street coming out and saying we've had enough of these sort of economic and social and other problems that have bedeviled us for way too long. So what does all this mean in terms of impacts? And I guess the first thing is on the domestic economies of the region, and there are going to be immediate negative economic impacts. We're talking about key states going into recession in 2011, possibly into 2012 as well. Growth figures, the latest projections, this is from the Institute of International Finances, negative 4% growth in Yemen, negative 3% in Tunisia, negative 2.5% in Egypt, negative 1.5% in Tunisia, and several other states struggling to have anything more than zero or slightly above zero rates of growth. Oil is also a key issue though, and let's remember in a sense the economies of the Arab world or the Middle East are now bimodal. You're either an oil economy or you're not, and if you are, things are going rather well. So at the same time as these states most impacted by the protests are going into recession this year and probably next year, the oil exporters are doing rather well. They're looking at 11% growth this year, probably 11.5% next year. And that compares when you had suppressed demand for oil and the effects of the GFC of barely 0.5% in 2010. So things look rather good if you're sitting in Dubai or Doha or Kuwait City or Riyadh. Economically, at least, it looks rather positive, but it doesn't for much of the region. And if we're talking across the region, then there are real issues there. Some of the dynamics we might see is tension between, again, the rich and the poor, or the oil and non-oil states, calls by the non-oil states for some of the sovereign wealth fund investments of the oil states to be sent towards these non-oil states. Remember, the Middle East, and it's predominantly the oil exporters, have a last estimation about $1.8 trillion of government funds invested into sovereign wealth funds, plus spare foreign currency reserves, which in Saudi Arabia alone are 440 odd billion US dollars. You have, I think, non-oil states that are going to start to seek, in fact, demand greater aid payments from oil states, or investment, or greater opportunity to export labour, or other links like that, tourism, investment, residential investment perhaps, but you're going to see greater calls on the oil states, I suspect, by the non-oil states, including potentially by new leaders in places like Tunisia and Egypt, who don't want to be going to the World Bank, the UN, the United States, the EU, if they could afford it, for aid and things like that. Some of these economies, though, remember, may rebound more quickly than we think. And I'm thinking here of the example of tourism in Egypt. It always looks bad when you have a tax on tourists. And I was looking at this in the 90s when I was doing my doctorate. Egypt, of course, had nasty attacks on tourists in 1993, 96, 97, and smaller ones in the early 2000s. But when I was there was actually an attack on a group at one of the hotels in Cairo, and the next day I was seeing a hotel manager and said, "Are you worried about this?" And he said, "Well, no, not really, because we've got an upward trend in tourism, and it's a long-term, quarter-century sort of upturn, which is what it's proved to be fair on him." And he said, "Look, tourism just absolutely plummets when something happens. So just from an event yesterday or the day before, we've got cancellations of 70, 80% from Europe in terms of our hotel bookings. But we know how this works. It bounces right back. And we're used to that. We know how to survive. We've got some labour market adaptability. We've got some funds put aside to cover this type of thing." So I do wonder if that's a possibility here, that these economies, they have often diverse sources of rent. Some are quite diversified industrially. I wonder if they can do okay in the sort of medium term, even if short term some of this stuff looks rather scary. The rent does help, remember. So in a place like Egypt, you've got not just tourism, which has dried up, but you've got the Suez Canal revenues, which are as healthy as ever. You've got some industrial base, you've got some agricultural base, you've got transport links, you've got other things like that, which give us some hope there as well. And that's true generally in Tunisia as well, which has a large agricultural centre. It's a large industrial manufacturer, especially of light and simply transformed manufactures. It's a tourist destination and should recover, like I say, medium term. So there is some room for hope, I suppose, but we need to be careful. And if this does drag out, if we see negative economic impacts in the region that go beyond the short term, that's when I think we might see some impacts on Australia in terms of inward investment into Australia, obviously damper demand for Australian exports in many cases, although we're lucky that some of what we export has fairly inelastic demand. It's broadly something which the region needs to purchase, something of bulk agricultural commodities or minerals or things like that. We may see requests for aid coming into Australia, although I think a lot of leaders in the region are going to be careful to distance themselves from that. And other than that, it's difficult to say. It would take a dramatic deterioration, I think, in the region for us to see real immigration impacts or diplomatic impacts or things like that on our links with the Middle East. More widely, in terms of the impacts on the global economy and on oil and gas, remember that globally, what's happening with the protest is only one of several problematic things. We're also coming out of, or much of the world is coming out of the global financial crisis. That's been a particular factor that has dampened energy demand for the last 2 years. There's particular problems with sovereign debt, especially in some of the Eurozone countries. And that's a real issue as well. If you're wondering what spooks markets at the moment, it's much less the protests, and it's much more things like the economic future of Greece and of Portugal and of Iceland and Ireland and others. That's much more of an issue in a way, because you're talking there about impacts through debt defaults or impacts through Germany or others having to rescue these countries and prop up the euro, which are much more economically profound than the protests. At the same time, there's significant growth in China and India and elsewhere, and that's pushing energy prices up, even as a lot of developed economies are struggling. You've got other issues still lingering, the food price issue, which I've mentioned. And the big issue to me here, really, in terms of energy impacts especially, is going to be the duration of these protests and any instability, and above all, whether they spread to areas that are vulnerable in terms of oil and gas. So were we to see a repeat or a third stage, if you like, of the Bahraini protests, or if they were to spread into Shia areas of Saudi Arabia, you would have real risks to oil supply. For the moment, we simply don't have that. The Saudis made up lost Libyan production very easily. They still have 1.5 million barrels a day or more of spare capacity left after doing that. So we don't really have a a threat at the moment of a cut in world supply or supply which is actually less than demand, at least not for the moment. We may do if you see multiple countries, large wealthy countries, coming out of the GFC into very high growth rates. But for the moment, that doesn't look likely. So in the absence of these protests spreading or becoming embedded and deep, I can't see too much of an impact, really. Oil prices at the moment are rather low. That sounds funny to say that when you're paying $100 a barrel, but you think about what you're getting out of that barrel of oil and how much energy you're getting. These are still not high prices. These are going back to still just under the spikes that we saw in 2008 and in 1980. The protests are not impacting these prices as much as people think. It's other things, like I say. Asian demand is probably the key issue. Downstream capacity is one of the great threats to long-term oil prices, at least what you pay at the bowser. The investment into midstream and downstream oil is simply hasn't been going into the sector. It did briefly in the 2000s, but something in the order of $25 to $30 trillion worth of investment is needed over the next 20 years to sustain production and expand it to the projected levels of demand. That sort of investment we're not even close to, and that's a longer-term threat, I think, which is an issue. The other great problem with oil, we don't actually know where we're standing with it right now. We don't know if we're sitting on a plateauing peak in global production and whether that's it, whether production has basically peaked. Are we now going into this downhill slope of post-peak oil that people talk about, or are we about to go into a new phase of production? If you believe the optimistic stuff, there's as much oil under the ground in Iraq as there is in Saudi Arabia. All the unconventional stuff is coming on stream, so there's as much in Canada as there is in Saudi Arabia as well. So there's an optimistic view and a pessimistic one, and I don't know the answer. I'd be very wealthy and I wouldn't be standing here if I knew the answer to that one. Gas is less of an issue. That's mostly traded under long-term conditions. The main issue there is some sort of glut in gas that we're likely to get, especially with unconventional glut coming on stream. Unconventional gas coming on stream. The fact that there's a glut because of American domestic production resurfacing through unconventional production. This could hit some countries in the Middle East, but gas production is far less widely spread in the region than oil. So finally, a couple of quick thoughts, and I will wrap up now with looking out longer term. I guess the more philosophical political economy questions, if you like, about the region and the protests. The first great one to me is, what will the future economic development orthodoxies and strategies of the region actually be? Given the global financial crisis, now the protests, is this basically the end of the, what Tony Blair called the Washington Consensus, but what's actually the post-Washington Consensus? Is that sort of neoliberalism with a bit of a social and environmental conscience dead, or is it just being challenged? Is it going to be somehow tinkered with, or is it really, does it need open heart surgery to survive? Assuming that it is dead, what comes next? It's not enough to just say people are unhappy with elements of the post-Washington Consensus. You need something to come after that if you're a government concerned about stability, development, and things like that. And there's various options, none of which are terribly convincing. One is the Beijing Consensus, this idea that Beijing provides some model for the region, perhaps a return to strong state capitalism and interventionist states, economic populism, Islamic economics, a Turkish AKP type of model where you have a soft Islamist party trying to Islamize the system, to legitimize it. Other questions very quickly: if change comes, what will it actually be like? But if it doesn't come, what does that mean in terms of the long-term prospects? Will we see another round of protests in 2015 or 2018 if nothing really changes, which is one of my fears, that we won't see any deep change come out of some of this stuff. Let me wrap it up there. I'll just finish with a couple of cartoons to give you a flavour of what's being said in the Arab world about a lot of this stuff. And I think they're quite good, actually. So you've got one there with the Arab street, of course, being stoked and fired up by a whole range of issues. And there's things like poverty and corruption, unemployment, repression, violence, things like that. So that sort of is fairly obvious. And I think, when you look at all those issues stoking the Arab street that are economic in nature, does show you that there's that acknowledgement of the role of economics in the region in being a source of the protests. Everybody's talking about this as a Facebook revolution. That's part of the assessment in the Arab world as well. This one here too on the bottom left to me is telling and cutting and very accurate. And you've got the Arab world there, which has turned its back on reforms and standing at the precipice with no other options. Again, this is the catch. They need reform, but reform is unpopular. People associate reform with the negative elements of the status quo, which is the last thing they want. That's the catch, and I dare say the problem for the autocrats of the region and for any new governments that come into power. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you very much. It's always, I suppose, instructive to look at what passes as satire in a region to understand what they're really thinking about. Can I now open the floor to questions that you may have of the panel? And Lacey will be up there with a microphone. Peter.
Peter Grabowski, Regulatory Institutions Network here at the ANU. If you look around the world over the past half century or so at transitions from autocratic to relatively democratic rule, it seems to me that a common characteristic has been a very significant increase in crime. This is something that's been evident in places as diverse as post-apartheid South Africa, after the suspension of martial law in Taiwan, of course, the former Soviet Union, Chile after Pinochet. And I believe just a few days ago, the New York Times had an article about increase in crime in Egypt. It seems to me that if democracy does take hold in the Middle East, that one will see similar increases in crime, which of course may impact on economic development, and then as far as Australian relations are concerned, both aid and trade relations. I'm just interested in the comments of the panel on those issues.
And thank you, Peter. And Peter's question went to crime in the region, increases in crime as a result of these uprisings. Jill, any thoughts on that? And if you just...
I think that's a very important point, but when you look at across the region, the crime has not been really as high as it would be, for example, in Western countries. There is more domestic security. There's been plenty of political crimes, there's no question about that. But in terms of the criminal activities on the part of the individuals, whether it is in Iran or for that matter in Syria or Jordan or even Egypt under Mubarak, they were not really as high as, for example, we witnessed daily in the Western country or for that matter in North America and more specifically the United States. So I'm not really sure whether really crime has been a major factor, but there's no question that I think certainly corruption is a very, very major factor. Right across the board. And definitely political repression. The important thing is, I was in Dubai in Saudi Arabia 3 weeks ago. And one of the things that you hear from the people, and this is an oil-rich states, you're not complaining about their economic situation. You're not complaining about their standard of living. You're primarily complaining about the fact that there's no space for them, for expressing their views, for participating in the process of policy making and policy implementation. The outcry, for example, in the UAE is on the part of Emiratis. When I was there, the latest statistics, the latest census was released, which claimed that United Arab Emirates had 10.5 million population, but the Emiratis formed only 11% of that. But that is the formal figure. Informally, many Emirati friends of mine claimed that Emiratis will not count for more than 8% at the most. So they become a real minority in their own country, and you're extremely worried about that. You're extremely worried about the future of their children. That's what's really bothering them. Yes, they've got the standard of living, they've got the economic means, they live in these incredible palaces, and they've all got servants and this and that and so on. That's not, for them, that's not really the issue. But of course, the case of Egypt is different. Where the poverty really comes into the factor, into the consideration. But not there, and not so much in Saudi Arabia. But in Saudi Arabia, the same sort of thing. The young people are saying that, look, we have no participation, no saying. The royal family, composed of 7,000 princes and princesses, operate almost as a party, and as a not only controlling the levels of political power, but also economic, as well as being a participant in the most social and educational activities of the nation. So that is what we're really concerned about, very much at the moment. But it varies, I think, from country to country, and would have to really, the peculiarities of every country would have to be really looked at. It's very extremely difficult to sort of generalize about the region as a whole, as I think both Rodger and Matthews.
Thank you. Did you want to have a quick...
Yeah, just a quick addition to that. To me, the examples that you point to are examples where you've had authoritarian state collapse, often very quickly in the case of the former Soviet Union, or the collapse of apartheid or something like that. In other cases, you've got weak state control and expansion of organised crime. So a lot of the Central American and Mexican crime at the moment, for example, is drug-related violence or drug-related crime. And so the question to me, therefore, becomes, are we going to see systemic change out of this or not? Is the role of the state and the state's control over society actually going to decline as a result of the protests or not? And I'm probably more pessimistic, sober, cynical, whatever you want to call it, that I haven't seen the evidence of that yet, really. Very modest political change in Tunisia, very, very little, almost cosmetic change in Egypt. If you don't have a retreat of the mukhabarat, the intelligence services, if you don't have a decline in law and order, if you don't have a decline in the state's ability to control the streets, if you don't have a decline in the state's ability to fight crime, I don't see a reason for there to be an impact on crime figures, certainly not a large one anyway.
Okay, let's move on. Ambassador.
Thank you, Sven-Olof Pettersson. I'm the Swedish ambassador, but I'm not here representing my country. I'm here as an interested observer. Well, first of all, I think it was interesting to note that you seem to be fairly pessimistic, all of you. And I came to think of a colleague who was an Arabist, and when I asked him about the revolution in the Arab world, he said, you must be clear that this is not the kind of revolution you are thinking about. This is the kind of revolution that Copernicus was speaking about. Everything's just going around and coming back. Is this how you view it, actually? Two other questions. Why is it, can you explain as experts, why is it that the conservative monarchies seem to be doing so much better than the republics, who supposedly was more modern, forward-looking? One explanation is, of course, what Rodger mentioned, some of them can throw money on the problem, but many cannot. Jordan, Morocco, etc., Oman. And you also mentioned, Rodger, Lebanon, where I served very early in the 70s, that this is now an island of calm, as is where I also served in the 70s, somehow Algeria. When I was there, you could really the frustration among the people was almost palpable, and it turned very badly for a number of years. But now, at least relatively, compared to the other republics, it seems to be very, very stable. Why is that so?
Interesting questions, and go to about the impact of the different political systems on the unrest, and also a bit more about Lebanon. Rodger, can we invite you to start?
Thanks. Yeah, there was quite a few questions. I might start in reverse order. Lebanon is stable for a variety of reasons. Stable even though it doesn't have a government. The largest political party looks as though it's going to have 4 people indicted for assassinating a former prime minister. About 10 people were shot and killed on the border with Israel yesterday. So it's a funny kind of stability, but you're right, it is a kind of stability. I think I'd say 2 things. First of all, it's stable because it's nearly impossible. There's no real centre in Lebanon to protest against. So the system is so fouled up that you can't protest against the system. Everybody is surrounded and entrapped by it. So the only protests are protests, which I imagine may have been going on when you were there, protests against sectarianism. They're tiny protests. People are trying to undertake them, but it's not really having any impact. And the other issue is, why is it stable? It's because of the electoral law. My research was on political opposition to Hezbollah and various types of political parties and individuals trying to take them on politically. It's virtually impossible. The system, with its majoritarian nature, just reinforces the rule of the oligarchs. Hezbollah just happens to be a party, but it operates in similar fashion to the Sunni and the Christian oligarchs. If you're not on their electoral list, you're not going to get elected. So this whole notion of a third force for the Shia, really not going to happen. The whole notion of similar people changing the system from inside in Lebanon, not going to happen. So I think it's just the system is so ossified, and there's no centre to protest against that. That's why protests aren't there. The issue of why monarchies are so stable compared to the republics, I think part of it is, and you're right, part of it is a lot of them are rich, but it was educational that when I said, I think the point I missed out about denying Iran an opportunity to take advantage of the current unrest. The second point, which I didn't mention, which was in the papers I think last week, was the GCC announced invitations to join the GCC would be accepted from 2 other countries, Jordan, who at least shares a common border with one of the GCC states, and Morocco, which is a pretty long way away from the GCC states. But both of them share 2 characteristics. They're Sunni monarchies, so ipso facto they're considered stable. A lot of reasons why they are more stable, but I don't think you can go too far past the notion of, in Arabic, the asabiyya, the notion of kinship loyalty, so loyalty within a tribe and also to a preeminent ruler, which again is a kind of internal social contract, but if you can combine that with an economic social contract, that's even better. But I think in Jordan in particular, there is a great degree of loyalty to the centre, and as you know, if you're not loyal to the centre, then the Palestinians will take you over, so, or that's their fear. So I think that's one of the reasons why the monarchies are institutionally more stable, and why another reason why the GCC look to Sunni monarchies, because they're just as stable. And I think in that first question that you asked, I am pessimistic, but the only hint of optimism I have is that if Egypt can get a functioning democratic system out of this uprising, that they are large enough and influential enough to have some kind of set some kind of example to other Arab states. I think if nothing comes out of the Egyptian experiment, we'll just go back to what was there before. But it's funny, a colleague at the Lowy Institute who just came back from Egypt said that things are happening very quickly. So there's no the same people who are on the protests are now setting up political parties, and they're pretty well exhausted because a lot of them are late 20s, early 30s, actually have jobs and families. They were losing money by being in the protests. They expected to have a kind of big interregnum period where they could recharge themselves, go back to work, get money. Because of the shortened period for the elections, between now and the elections, they're setting up their own political parties. They've got to go back to work to get money. They thought there'd be a big break between phase 1 and phase 2. They've just gone straight into phase 2, and they are exhausted, which also makes their ability to get these political parties up and running quite difficult because they've got so much on their plate, full of youthful enthusiasm, but just too much to do in too short a time.
And rather than, I think we might move on to a separate question, just in the interest of time. We do have another question up the back there. We'll hold on, Matthew, maybe come back. And if we make this a quick question with a snappy response or two, we can leave on time.
My name is Ronan Kaplan. I'd just like to bring the conversation back to something that was mentioned earlier, but no one seems to be touching on. One of the provinces you would expect to be swept up in a revolution as they've been, most plausible to do these kinds of things. The Palestinian territories have been one of the most calm Arab state-like entities, despite the Israeli occupation. Why do you think that, bar the Nakba protests that we've seen over the last few days, which have been not very substantial, why do you think that they have not been a part of this Arab awakening, as it seems to be a perfect representation of what they are fighting for their freedom and self-determination?
And the question is about the Palestinian territories and the relative calm there. Gentlemen.
In a sense, there's exactly the same problems there as you've got anywhere else. The challenge is that you've got such divisions amongst the Palestinians that any form of mobilisation is very difficult. So within Gaza, in effect, who are they going to mobilise against? They could rush down to the border with Egypt or Israel and throw some rocks, but they're not going to protest Hamas. They don't have a great focus on, or they don't have a great Fatah focus there anymore to protest against in Gaza. In the West Bank, that depends on who you ask. You ask an Israeli and he'd say the West Bank is booming, 8% growth, low unemployment, this is a benevolent occupation, etc., etc. The real reason, I suspect, is that the PA is repressive enough and Israel is supportive enough of that to try and keep that repressed. And also, the West Bank now is so physically divided. This is just a set of cantons split up by hundreds upon hundreds of checkpoints, barriers, military bases, Israeli-only roads crossing and things like that. So the actual mechanics of having a true mass uprising are simply not there. You've got the greatest chance of success of a mass uprising in a large urban centre, in Cairo, Alexandria, Tunis, even in Manama, but not in, I don't think, not in Nablus, not in Jericho, not in what's left of the Palestinian areas of Jerusalem.
One final question.
Pedro Villagra, Ambassador of Argentina. Following up on the question of Palestine, what do you think could be the effect, or if you will have any, of this agreement between Hamas and Fatah for the Palestinians? And also, the question is, one of the things that was mentioned is that all these rebellions in Egypt and Tunisia, the question of Palestine was not very much in the minds of the youth. Do you think that that will continue if the situation in Palestine territories do not change, in the sense of not making any progress in the peace process and repression and things like that?
And the question continues on the theme of the reaction in Palestine. Amin, would you like to?
I think this Fatah and Hamas unity pact, which has been signed, it's going to face a lot of hurdles and a lot of problems. And both Fatah and Hamas will have to come over very deep ideological and political differences between them. One is a secularist group, which basically seeks a secularist transformation of an independent Palestinian state, whereas the other one is an Islamist in its ideological disposition, and therefore seeks an Islamist transformation of an independent Palestinian state. But at the same time, I think both sides, the leaderships, have come under enormous public pressure from the Palestinians that they have to, and the Palestinians are motivated by what's transpired in Egypt and what's transpired in Tunisia and perhaps in some other parts in Yemen and so on, that Fatah and Hamas would have to bury their differences. Particularly prior to the General Assembly meeting in September, the Palestinian Authority is going to move the motion that the General Assembly recognize an independent Palestinian state. And they've done their numbers, and they think that something like about 130 members of the General Assembly would support an independent Palestinian state. But of course, it's not going to have any effect. I mean, it's not going to be binding on whatever resolution the General Assembly is going to pass. I think, to me, it all appears that all the cards are really in the hands of the Israelis, not really the Palestinians. It will really depend whether, the Israelis are going to make the necessary concessions in support of creation of an independent Palestinian state out of Gaza and West Bank, and of course, perhaps Jerusalem to a considerable extent, and also whether the Israelis are going to create a corridor between Gaza and the West Bank to connect the two and allow such a corridor to really function. I mean, one of the items of the Hamas-Fatah pact is to hold a general election. There is no way that you can hold fair and free elections in the Palestinian territories while the Israelis, as Matthew pointed out, has divided the whole territory in different, and control it from every, from the air and from the ground, and also in the case of Gaza, from the sea and everything else. And then at the same time, Gaza and West Bank are physically separated, and the Israelis control that altogether. So I think, you can call on the Palestinians to be more reasonable and try to be more amenable to international pressure and this and that and so on, and they've been doing it, like the Bush administration kept calling for democratization of Palestinian politics, and finally when the Palestinians said, okay, we are going to democratize, we're going to have a general elections, then they held it in January 2006, then, and it was declared by independent observers as free and fair and democratic, and then they turn around and say, no, we are not going to accept this outcome. I mean, it won't work. And this is what's going to be also the problem in the case of Egypt. I mean, it's very possible now that the Muslim Brotherhood would do very well because, I mean, as I think as Rodger pointed out, that looked up, people are exhausted, they are not going to be able to get themselves organized into effective political parties and all this sort of thing. But the Muslim Brotherhood is very well organized and is ready for and the Mubarak's party has been dissolved. So the Muslim Brotherhood may well do very well and may well fill the power vacuum issue. And then will the United States and its European allies, as well as Israel, will really accept that outcome? And I don't expect a Muslim Brotherhood government necessarily to be unreasonable altogether, because it will still have to function within a pluralist system. Whatever is going to happen to the current uprisings, my personal belief is that it's going to change the Arab politics, and we are going to move more and more towards pluralist orders in the Arab countries. And even the countries which are resisting it at the moment, I think eventually they will have to make way for that. And just on the point of why some of the monarchies are more stable than republicans. Well, I mean, look at what's happening in Syria. It's supposed to be really a republic, but monarchies, there are two types of monarchies in the Middle East. One is, which is sort of the monarch is somewhat separated from the public in the sense that there is a prime minister and there's a cabinet, and the monarch can easily, in the case of Jordan, pushes the blame on the government, and therefore says, I'm above politics. And therefore, I can appoint a new government, I can appoint a new prime minister, and therefore, I can promise the new reforms. And that's what the Jordanian king has done. But then you've got monarchies like, for example, in Sultanate of Oman, you've got Sultan Qaboos. Sultan Qaboos doesn't have any children. And he doesn't have to really worry whether his throne is passed on to a member of his family or not. In fact, he has been very quick on his feet to make enormous concessions to the public. And as a result of that, he's been able to overcome the public protests and so on. The case of Saudi Arabia is again unique, and I want to go back to the point that I think the cases will have to be looked at individually. It's very difficult to make generalizations across the board. And at this point, I'm not terribly pessimistic about the future either. Thank you.
And I think on that nuance, we'll have to leave the discussion there. I think you'll agree with me that our speakers tonight have covered an extraordinary breadth of subject material, covered it well, but also covered it in a very sober way. And I think the sober identification of the interest or the impact of Australian interests and the implications for Australia is one that I think we should be taking away and thinking about further. But just because that's been a relatively downbeat assessment on our impacts on our security, it has absolutely no impact upon the level of interest shown by the audience and by you tonight for coming out. And I do thank you very much for doing that. Before I invite you to leave, I would ask you first to thank the speakers for their role tonight, and to thank you very much for on behalf of the Director of the National Security College and the staff of the college, I'd like to thank you again very much for coming along. We hope to see you at future events where we'll again look at significant challenges for Australia's national security. Thank you.